In April of 1954, a single example of a locomotive was constructed in the UK, dubbed Duke of Gloucester. While she was meant, originally, to be the next step in British locomotive engineering, her career was constantly held back with frequent mechanical issues due to some oversights in her design. As a result, she would not serve very long, and when British Railways modernized the railway system and replaced their steam traction with diesels, Duke was one of the first ones to be sent to the scrapyard. But through a sheer stroke of luck, she wound up surviving in that scrapyard and was saved by preservationists, who not only brought her back up to steam, but modified her to make her one of the best steam locomotives ever to run on British rail lines. Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse, and before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains noble. And today, we are going to discuss the British Rail Standard Class 8, otherwise known as the Duke of Gloucester. Easily one of my personal favorite British steam locomotives. This is her story. In the early days of the newly nationalised railway system over in the UK, known as British Railways, the idea of completely replacing steam traction hadn't actually gotten to maturity just yet. For a while, they actually developed new steam locomotives, far longer than a lot of other countries did. While over here in America, most railways had significantly dieselized, British Rail was still ordering new classes of steam locomotives, which were known as the BR Standards. Since they were now a nationalized railway system, the idea of standardizing their traction was an early thought, and they were doing it with the steam locomotives at the time. Many of the BR Standards were actually extremely good, designed by Robert Riddles, who, he might as well have been called British Railways Chief Mechanical Engineer, but that wasn't exactly his title. In any event, Riddles really loved steam traction and wanted to continue developing new steam locomotives, so he often argued the case to justify building even more, which is how the Standard Class 8 came about. He envisioned the type as a Pacific, a 462, and he proposed it multiple times, but it was always rejected at first because of the cost in attempting to develop a new form of steam motive power that wasn't necessarily required for use on Britain's railways, as there were already plenty of Standard Class 7s that could do the work just fine. Plus, in the background, British Railways was inching towards their modernization plan, so they were probably going to replace steam anyway. But as fate would have it, Riddles would finally be given the opportunity to build his envisioned Class 8, due to an accident, and a tragic one at that. The Harrow and Wealdstone rail crash involved 3 different trains, and it happened on the 8th of October 1952 during morning rush hour. It killed 112 people and injured 340, and it remains the worst peacetime rail crash in British history, only superseded by the Quintenshill rail disaster of 1915, though that was during World War I. In any event, one of the locomotives that was involved in that crash was 46202 Princess Anne. She was a rebuilt LMS Turbomotive, which was a steam turbine locomotive developed by William Stanier, though as Princess Anne she had been rebuilt into a conventional locomotive. But she only worked in that form for less than a year before the accident, and she was so utterly destroyed that fixing her just wasn't even considered. She was scrapped. Because of her loss, a gap now existed in the roster for locomotives with an 8P power classification, and the demand was high for the efficient operation of heavy expresses on the West Coast Main Line between London, Euston, and Scotland. Riddles seized the chance to press his case for the new design that he desperately wanted to build, and the suits finally gave him what he wanted, authorizing a single prototype, which would be constructed at Crewe Works. At first, Riddles was only looking to develop what was effectively an enlarged version of the standard Class 7, and the early design still featured a 2-cylinder layout, but he found that this was not going to work, because the size of the cylinders that were required in order to achieve an 8P power classification would put the design over the British loading gauge limit. So he had to modify his plans, reluctantly, but he did it, and the revision wound up being a 3-cylinder layout. But Riddles was hesitant to move forward with a lot of the other aspects of the design because, from his experience with the Gresley Pacifics, he knew that their conjugated valve gear was really annoying to maintain due to the location of the middle cylinder between the frames. Riddles knew that his bosses certainly weren't going to be happy about a new locomotive that was a pain to maintain. They were looking for something efficient, and that would be the opposite of that, so he had to find an alternative. And eventually he settled upon something new for British rail lines anyway. It was the Caprati valve gear, which was an Italian invention. This would be the rotary cam-driven form of it, developed by Heenan and Freud with poppet valves. This valve gear allowed for precise control of steam admission to the cylinders while improving exhaust flow and boiler drafting characteristics, especially when compared to other more conventional valve gears like Wolshart's and Stephenson's. Not that those were bad at all, but Riddles wanted to innovate with this design, so Caprati seemed like a good idea. With this valve gear, on paper anyway, it should have created a free-steaming, hard-working locomotive that could haul heavy loads over long distances. However, that's not how this went. The locomotive wound up with fundamental design errors and undetected deviations from the drawings, the latter of which obviously wasn't really Riddles' fault, and at least one of the issues was already known about even while the locomotive was still being built. Mr. L.T. Daniels, who was a representative of the British Caprati Company, had recommended the use of the Kyle-Chap blast pipe. The reason for this is that the Caprati system resulted in fierce exhaust blasts, and a Kyle-Chap blast pipe would be able to deal with that. But a standard double chimney of the Swindon type had already been fabricated in order to cut construction costs. This gave the locomotive a choke area. Both the chimney and the blast pipe were too small for the pressure that was created by the exhaust, leading to very poor drafting. And other issues in her design weren't discovered until far later, and I mean like after she was already out of service and being restored. Her firebox, for example, had a poorly dimensioned ashpan and dampers that were also too small, that strangled the fire of air while she was operating at speed. Given the fact that British Railways was in the process of figuring out their modernization plan, it's possible, though never proven, that they just really did not care about this locomotive, like, at all, and it only authorized the construction of the prototype just to shut Riddles up for a while. That's a theory, but again, there's no evidence of that. But it does seem pretty suspicious that even during construction they knew about at least one of these major issues, but still went through with the weaker option, because I mean, if they knew they weren't going to use this locomotive for a while, that cost-cutting does make sense for them. But the design did offer some benefits here. For example, the standard Class 7s sometimes suffered cracks that appeared near the spring brackets. Riddles had rearranged that area that resulted in the locomotive riding on 3 cast steel subframes that carried the 10 frontmost spring brackets and lengthened spring brackets behind the rear driven axle. And those weren't actually integrated into a cast combined subframe pivot stretcher. The locomotive was finally finished in April of 1954, but Riddles was disappointed to find out that she would remain a single example. British Railways felt the design process had been too expensive and complicated. And again, modernization plan. Why would they build more? It didn't make any sense for them. The locomotive was numbered 71,000, and she would be given no siblings, remaining an only child. In addition to a number, she was named Duke of Gloucester. This is because of the planned class that Riddles wanted to make was supposed to be the Duke class. But again, since she's the only one, well, she's the only one. But in operation, the flaws really came back to bite her. Crews hated her so much. she wasn't good. It was due to the previously mentioned flaws with her firebox, as well as that choking issue with her exhaust and blast pipes. She never steamed well, at all, ever, so the crew struggled to keep her going. And because they had no interest in developing the class any further, those problems weren't fixed. She remained in that flawed state for the entirety of her revenue service, when if she had been built even just 10 years prior, they would have sent her back to the shops and had the problems corrected. And she probably would have had sisters, but that's not what happened here. She actually spent her entire working life at Crewe North Depot, where she hauled boat trains on the rather undemanding North Wales coastline between Crewe and Holyhead. It was work that pretty much any locomotive that they had could have done, but they just stuck her there because they just didn't really care about her. They weren't developing the class, they were focusing on buying diesels, and she was flawed. They couldn't put her on heavier trains because she would have been even more of a pain in the butt. And she only worked on the rail lines for about 8 years before finally being withdrawn in 1962, along with many of her cousins. The modernization plan ushered in, well, the age of diesels for the UK, and as a result, thousands of steam engines were sent to the scrapyards to be cut up. And the Duke was included in that. Though, she actually almost got preserved by British Railways, believe it or not. British Railways did go through and choose some of their steamers for preservation, and the Duke was considered because A, she was a single example, and B, because of that Caprati valve gear. Her cylinder arrangement was unique, so they felt it was worth preserving, but that was kind of an issue. They felt that only her cylinder arrangement was interesting, not her. So instead of choosing to preserve the entire locomotive, they just removed one of her outside cylinders for display at the Science Museum, and the opposite one was also taken off to restore balance in readiness for scrapping. She wound up being purchased by Di Woodham of the Woodham Brothers Scrapyard, obviously to be cut up. Although, initially she was actually sent to the completely wrong scrapyard. When Mr. Woodham found out, he obviously was like, hey, I paid for that? And they were able to retrieve her and send her to the right scrapyard to be cut to pieces. Woodham Brothers Scrapyard is located at Barry Island, South Wales. But here was the thing about the Woodham brothers. They've come up a lot in my videos, and there's a very good reason for it. This particular scrapyard is directly responsible for a significant bulk of the preserved steam locomotives that are currently still in the UK. British Rail, for their part, did not choose that many to be preserved, as it wasn't considered a major priority in their eyes. And normally, when something gets into a scrapyard, that's bad, because it's going to be destroyed. But the Woodham brothers was different. It wasn't just that the Woodham brothers liked steam locomotives. It was actually a purely financial decision on their part. As a part of the modernization plan, in addition to replacing the steam locomotives, British Railways was also in the process of replacing a lot of their old rolling stock, the cars, many of which were very dated. The cars were a lot easier and faster to break down. Therefore, the Woodham brothers found that it was way more profitable for them to do those first. And since they were given just so many cars, the steam locomotives, since they were shoved at the bottom of priorities in terms of scrapping, sat for years. And the Duke herself would sit there for over a decade, 12 years to be precise. The preservation movement got into full swing during the 1960s, and when preservationists in the UK found out how many steam locomotives were in the Woodham Brothers scrapyard, they frantically tried to purchase them directly from the scrappers to prevent them from being destroyed. And the scrapyard was totally fine with this. They would sell the locomotives to preservationists as long as the preservationists paid them the scrap value that they had paid to British Railways, in addition to the fee that also had to be paid to British Railways if the locomotive wasn't scrapped. The Duke herself was found and purchased by preservationists in 1974, who wound up forming the Duke of Gloucester Steam Locomotive Trust, with the intention to bring her back into operation. But this would be a tall order. It wasn't just that she just sat around for 12 years. I mean, that was part of it, but also they found that a lot of her components were missing, particularly the Caprati valve gear, which wasn't the scrapyard's fault. Remember, her outside cylinders were removed by British Railways before they even sent her to the scrapyard. It would actually take them another 13 years of effort, with much of the funding being raised by sponsorships from industry donors. They were trying to restore her to near as-built condition, but There were a handful of changes. One was a compromise. They replaced the previous steel cylinders with spheroidal graphite iron, sometimes known as ductile iron. But besides that, the other changes were mostly improvements. See, while they were restoring her, they noticed the problems and realized why she had suffered so much while in actual service. Her chimney was too small, for example, even when compared to other locomotives of similar size that didn't have a Caprati valve gear, it was still too small. And her firebox was messed up and hadn't been built according to the drawings. Those errors were corrected, and they decided, because why not, to incorporate other improvements, such as the Calchap exhaust system, which had already been recommended when she was being built. This change was probably the most critical one, as it would allow her to show off her true potential.
Wow, that's a lot of words. Too bad I'm not reading them.
When she was finally put back under steam and truly tested with a full train on the main line, the improvements spoke for themselves. The Duke was suddenly alive and alert, a far cry from the bitter failure she had been in original service. With the proper accommodations made, she went from struggling to work up enough steam to a free steamer, and one of the most powerful steam locomotives ever to run on Britain's railways, past or present. Fun fact, she's actually more powerful than the English electric Type 4 diesel locomotives, which replaced her quite directly in service. Oh, yeah, she's also more powerful than the ones that replaced the Type 4s.
I've got a peer-reviewed study right here that says... says you're a...
In 1995, she actually broke the record for the fastest northbound ascent over on the Shap lines, and achieved the highest EDHP figures during that time. Her average over the Shap ascent was 2300 and peak 2803. For reference, the Duchess of Hamilton, 46229, generated figures of 2150 and 2343 respectively. The Duke had crushed it. And during her preservation career, she's had an impeccable record of reliability, suffering only one major breakdown in 2007, which involved leaking tubes in the firebox, but that was corrected within a few months. Outside of that, she's become a legend among British rail fans, not just because she's an amazing locomotive, but also because of her ridiculous underdog story. She went from being one of the worst steam locomotives built for British railways to what is arguably the best ever, period. Because, well, she was actually built right. The preservationists didn't just restore her, they also corrected the problems. Some of those problems were already known about, it's just that British Railways didn't care at the time. But the preservationists did care, and wanted to see this engine shine again. And now, she does, to this day. And nowadays, she's actually kind of a testbed for new technologies. The new tech that keeps being added to her is to further investigate how hard she can really be pushed, just to see. Because why not at this point? And to further raise speculation surrounding what kind of capabilities an entire batch of standard Class 8s may have had. Not that that would have ever happened, because honestly, even if they had built the Duke right initially, they probably still wouldn't have given her any sisters, because, well, they were going with the diesels, like everyone else was. But regardless of any of that, I think at the end of the day, we can say that Robert Riddles would be proud to know the powerful, reliable, incredible standard Class 8 that he had so desperately envisioned and wanted to see did eventually shine like he always knew she would. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders, SomeDude267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Brian, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Hayden DeGrow, Master of None, Lord Hawk 444, The Baxter, That Guy with a Beard, Mark Holding, Murder Drone Stall, A-Person 723, DM Tribal Typhoon, Alfonso Lapuche, Royal Hudson 2860, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matthew Wolf, Ohio Trucker 1, Mr. Sleepy, Matt Weaver, Albert Jaspers, Tom Red Lion, NS Productions 8104, Hannah Bird, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, and Wheeljack 8401. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.